off. We're here for episode 34 of the show. Aggressive intro there. Don't know what needlessly aggressive someone say, which also could have been a great name for a show that I would host, Needlessly Aggressive, with me, Thorin. Welcome to the show. So, usual host, Thorin. Usual co-host, Kelsey Moser. Still. I mean, we pushed the boundary on that one last episode, but still the co-host for now. Basically, neither of us have anywhere better to go. So, sort of a few good men status, I guess. So, actually, Officer and Gentleman was the reference I was thinking of. I fucked up my own reference with a different movie.
Can't take you anywhere.
It's all right. I got back there. So, our guest for this episode is Rusty, because I've said this already on the show in the past. Considering the LPL is a massive league and has massive viewership, and every time there's an international competition, all of a sudden about 10,000 experts come out who will tell me, like, in depth what they thought about RNG during the regular split. Didn't see any of those people during the LPL split. Mainly just during the international competitions, they come out and tell me things about Uzi that they clearly don't even know, but they think I don't know because they've made them up in their own minds. But the point I'm getting to here is the actual shortlist of real humans who do watch the LPL, who I can actually go to for these shows. It's about 4 people, and one of them, all I'm going to say is, he's not a white guy. It's terrible responding to messages. At least 2 or 3 times has said he would come on the show, like, you know, a day after I've recorded the show. So I think we all know who I'm referring to there. He's straight fire on the show, if you can get him on the show. I think what I've got to do is start lying to that particular individual and tell him the show's like a week before, and then he'll be like, "Oh, right, yeah, 9 p.m. tonight," or whatever. Like, well, no, we don't just schedule around your life, whoever you might be, former NIP coach and writer of an article about the slow push. So
you have to contact him on Weibo. He's like always on Weibo now. It's right, really weird.
That's the way to get to him. Okay. Yeah. And obviously the only other people are Froscorin, who, well, there are different reasons why she doesn't appear on the show anymore. And then there's just Raz. And here's the thing. Love me some Raz. But you can't have Raz on every episode about the LPL. You've got to space him out, because the thing about him is you've got to binge drink Raz. You don't just want to have a little drink every night. You want to go fully 3 hours deep into that. Go completely off the... But if you had him every week, you know, just it'd start to wear on you. Right. Rusty.
Yes.
Are you ready to dive into this motherfucker, mate?
I'm absolutely ready to talk about some League of Legends.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things I've found interesting is Riot has begun to employ a system that we actually use in Counter-Strike, where what we do in Counter-Strike is we have tiers of casters, okay? And if you're tier 1, you do the final, obviously. You do the big semi-final. If you're tier 2, maybe you get on some of the games on the main show. If you're tier 2 / borderline tier 3, we've gotten ruthless as fucking Counter-Strike. Like, what we do is you either don't go to the event and you just do like online qualifiers for it, or even worse, you get to come to the event in CSGO. You do like the first 2 days, all the games no one gives a fuck about. And we're so ruthless now that they actually do send you home after that. And you're like, "See you guys." And then we're like, "All right, the real tournament's starting. Where are you going?" And then they just have to fly off home. And then we all just go, "Haha, glad we're not them." Now, in your position, you are one of the people doing the play-ins, right?
Yeah.
What was that like?
I mean, it's I've been doing the play-ins for a couple of years now, so it's not something that's foreign to me to be doing in the first place. So in that regard, it doesn't necessarily feel like they've gone, "Hey, have the side event, we'll do the main event, you can go home," type of thing after. It's kind of where I came from, right? From a wildcard region in Oceania. But it does still have that feeling. I will say that, you know, to relate it to the CSGO feeling there, it does feel a little bit bad there's no hype, or not as much hype, I should say, behind the play-in tournament. And then you go home, and when you're on a plane, the main event, so to speak, starts and everyone's more excited. I do think that exists and does persist through, but at least in my position, I'm actually quite excited for the other region, and Riot has a regular top season and these other things to compensate. Yeah.
Oh, listen, that's cool. Not everyone can be the prom queen, you know. I mean, we all know who the fucking prom queen is now. We don't even need to fuck around with that analogy anymore, do we? So anyway, Is it actually difficult to do the research for those regions then? Because, I mean, just beyond the fact that, these are some regions that people don't typically watch. Obviously, I always feel like in League of Legends, I actually give people a lot of room for not knowing things about other regions, because there's also the factor that you have no real basis to judge some of them on how they're going to be internationally or how they're going to be against a specific team, because you're just purely shadowboxing. They've never played that team. There's no track record. Is it tough to get research for that stuff?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, these are regions that don't all speak English in the first place. So you've got 7 teams. You've got maybe 2 weeks. For the LPL, for myself and Raz, we had like a 1-day turnaround between the finals and flying to do the play-ins events. So a lot of our research was done at the same time as doing the LPL finals. And getting that information then and sourcing that can be quite difficult. I'd say the most important thing is contacts, who you know, and who you can ask for that information, because ultimately if you can just message a friend and be like, tell me about this team, and you trust their opinion, then you'll have that good information.
Yes.
And a lot of it also comes from like the history and from knowing, having done them for 3 years now, Latin America North and South, it's very obviously a rivalry, right? But no one knows the record between them, that the junglers are the only two that have never faced each other before, and they've been shit talking on social media that we can't read. So things like that always come from just knowing the right person and from doing it for years.
I mean, the sad thing is, what you mentioned there, for anyone who's wondering, by the way, is what all the big casters do, to my knowledge, because no one logistically has the time to watch every region and go super in-depth. So what you do is you get people who you're friends with, who know those regions, they cast them, you ask them for some cliff notes, maybe, a few VODs I can watch. Funnily enough, a guy I used to do a show with himself used to do that, then had the audacity to wreck the same people on shows himself about them knowing nothing about their region, when he himself was getting the information from them. I did bring this up occasionally, like, that is a bit rich, isn't it? Friend of mine who may have done a show with me. I'm actually really bad. I've noticed it concealing people's identities, but I think it's funny to pretend like I'm concealing them when, I mean, it's basically blatantly obvious who all these people are in it, so it's just funny in that way. So I get to feel like I'm doing the right thing while just dishing dirt on everyone, just dropping dime on every motherfucker. Okay, I've got a question for you, Kelsey. So I actually really hate shows that go like, let's start at the beginning of the tournament, because you can't really wind the clock back like that. Obviously, everything afterwards will inform how you think about these things and will even change the perspective you have then. You would have had to do a show basically after every day, as you did. Now, obviously that ties into the old classic, if a tree falls in the woods on Kelsey Moser's YouTube channel, did anyone ever see or hear it? And does anyone care? Now, again, no one will ever know the true answer to that. The answer is no. But, we can all question that philosophical quandary. And all that really matters is, I would just embrace the philosophy of solipsism, Kelsey, as long as you care and as long as you put it out in the world. That's really all that matters. When you aren't looking, does anything else even exist? Wait a minute, shit, I've accidentally tied back into why your video doesn't matter, because if everyone else applies the same logic, then it doesn't exist. And so, yeah, my bad. That one, I didn't think of that one. It had a logical sort of trap in it that I got caught into as I was trying to make you feel better. But the question is this. So since, as he mentioned, LPL was basically the last league to finish before MSI, and for people who don't know, that wasn't necessarily the way LPL was going. Obviously, at one point in time, people thought, it would be IG and RNG in the finals, or maybe IG will win the league itself. In fact, most people were kind of already shadowboxing them against Kingzone, etc. So it was only towards the very end we found out it definitely was RNG. Now, this is where, as someone who did work with Monte Cristo, don't know why I've referenced that now, I wasn't talking about him at any point in this show. So, as someone who has worked with Monte Cristo, I had to allow him a certain period of the show in which to gloat and to remind him when he got things right. I am correct, yes, in saying that despite IG's very good record, weren't you one of the people who actually did have RNG pegged even before the playoffs to be potentially the best Chinese team?
I would like to take full credit for that, but I thought that RNG for sure would be the best team by summer.
Right, okay.
I wasn't quite convinced of spring, and I actually thought that in semifinals, but watching their playoff run, I thought that RNG would win if IG played the shy. I actually had more confidence in IG after they put Duke in, based on the way that the Shy plays with side lane pressure and the way that RNG as a team set up their 1-3-1.
Okay.
And how it counters a lot of the more aggressive, like hard side laning comps, and the way that Duke I think Duke has a very, very good idea of like setting up consistent pressure and just not necessarily over grouping once that he has a side control. So I actually thought IG would win because of Duke. And it ended up, RNG ended up winning because of something completely unrelated, which was mostly due to mid jungle. So it was all good.
Okay. Did we see any flashes in the LPL playoffs and the finals? Did we see any hints that RNG would be as good as they were at this tournament?
I mean, I think RNG are better at certain things than almost any other team in the world. And I think I've said this on a previous Narrative Wake. So I would say yes. But at the same time, of course, everyone's going to be extremely hesitant to peg them as the MSI champion at that point.
What do you think, Rusty?
Yeah, I think that RNG, as Kelsey said, actually, they excel at things that no other team in the league can. And I was just listening to the previous answer before, and I feel like there's a contrast of IG to Kingzone, right, with where they're strong and how they could perhaps win their lanes through those strong points. And as such, of course, win the games. And RNG being able to beat that also show that they have the capabilities to then be the best team in the world from that point onwards. And I do think that from the moment that they started to take down IG and they did beat them 3-2, you were seeing the capabilities there. And even though it was Duke and it wasn't the Shy, the growth that they had, I never thought that they'd be the winners of this tournament. I thought that they could beat IG for sure. And I do personally still think that the Shy was a slightly better option for them just because he's a bit more of a wild card and changed draft. But RNG specifically, bad, no idea. Didn't expect it at all.
Were they then a team basically that had the tools to deal with like dominant solo laners?
In a way, yeah. So Xiaohu and Letme are just two of the best soaking laners, solo laners that you will see. Xiaohu adaptable with his draft and Letme just knowing usually when to back away and not to die. And that's a byproduct of them having to work with their jungler for most of the split in mlxg, who can do some questionable things. You need to change as the game requires, right? Push lane, control lane, let him invade, or sit back, get dove, and just soak pressure. I think that is the tipping point for them through their solo laners that prove that it was more than enough to win a tournament like MSI. It's that they are adaptable and that they can change their style as required.
Okay. So, Kelsey, since obviously part of the, I mean, to some degree controversy, because I saw a lot of people disagreed with it, was the choice of the sub, where they brought the sub jungler, and then they did actually switch out Karsa and mlxg, depending on what they wanted to do, as opposed to taking the sub top laner. What was your reasoning as to why? You were one of the people who wanted them to take the sub top laner instead, right?
I think that there were still a lot of inconsistencies in terms of when Karsa played, and the mid-jungle communication seemed on point, as much as it was with mlxg and Xiaohu, who were just very comfortable with each other, who had played with each other a lot. I personally also think that jungle is one of the worst or one of the most difficult roles to have on a rotating roster, because it takes so long for a jungler to get used to what his lanes want and when he can pressure what side of the map and everything else. So that's whereas I felt like the rotation of Zatai and Letme was much more defined, and the team just seemed more well-oiled when they did that sub-rotation as opposed to the jungle one.
How do you think it actually played out then? Because obviously they did end up using both the junglers in different circumstances, and then eventually they plumped for Karsa in the final. But for anyone who didn't keep track of this, they even played mlxg for a game in the Fnatic series. So can you figure out what the rationale was behind when they played them, or how they played them, or were they just testing form and then they decided on Karsa? What do you think?
I think it probably had a lot to do with Karsa kind of making himself a bit nervous at times in the past in the LPL, and so that's why mlxg occasionally would go in. Of course, like, this is only information that I've heard from people either close to the team or in interviews, but I don't know like how it transferred over to MSI. This was just like regular season stuff, so it could have been completely different in MSI. So that's kind of, maybe they thought that the team was better with Karsa, but they weren't completely sure that the jungle rotation would be good and that he would be like stable enough that they could just bring Karsa in their top laners. So they wanted to make sure they had the jungle rotation on stage.
Okay. Right,
Yeah,
Rusty, how would you contrast those two junglers? Because one thing that I do get a bit tilted by is, for some reason, every time I saw people discussing mlxg in this tournament, that all the Redditors make out like he's some like joke jungler who's just garbage or something. Whereas I've definitely seen some games where he did some really weird shit, but I've seen some fantastic games from that player. So how would you contrast the two junglers for RNG?
I mean, it's just a perpetuated meme of mlxg, right? Everyone just jumps on the bandwagon and thinks he's bad. I would contrast the junglers, and this is actually something that RNG said, and maybe a PR answer, but I like it as a concept for both of them, is that mlxg is the best of one jungler, and Karsa is the best of 5 jungler, in that mlxg can be very unpredictable. He can be aggressive. He can make some big plays that no one would ever think of doing, because sometimes it doesn't make sense, and maybe it just doesn't make sense to the viewer, but he knows full well what he's doing and why he's doing it, right? He's smart and he's chaos. Where Karsa is slow, he's more patient. He tries to take the smaller victories, and instead of going for like the slam dunk, he'll take the pot shots from a little bit further out, knowing that it's safer and it's not as contested, to try and get smaller things. That's the major difference between both of them. And for what it's worth as well, they're actually very good friends with one another. After winning, they hugged each other. So they've fully embraced those two styles, I think, as well. And they're trying to legitimately have those two styles as options for RNG as a team.
Okay. What do you think, Kelsey, about where Xiaohu was in this tournament and coming in? I mean, generally, hasn't his form been like lower than we expected at the end of last year, where he was obviously a fabulous player, one of the best in the world? It seemed like in this tournament, he didn't really seem to live up to that level.
It's weird a little bit, because I think Worlds, he looked very, very strong. I think in 2016, if we talk about 2016, at MSI he looked very good, but at Worlds 2016 he didn't look that strong. So he's been a bit inconsistent at the international events that he's shown up to. I think that there has always been a few champions, and those change as the meta changes, that will show up the most on. Like his Vladimir will just completely take over the game right now, and obviously Vladimir is an obnoxious champion, but in its own right, it's one of the champions that he really, really shines on at the moment. And it was similar with his Corki around Worlds time, like LeBlanc around the previous MSI. So it really just sometimes depends on the champion that he's playing, where he can really get that kind of in-sync option. I also think that part of it did come to the fact that they initially showed up at MSI, and the jungle mid seemed like way more off than it normally was. We weren't seeing much pressure coming out of the jungle from mlxg, and so enemy teams were just focusing much more attention on mid as well, and he just was not reacting well to it. And they were not able to get good vision around the mid lane and in the river as consistently. Like their vision was really, really poor in the early stages of the tournament, and they were constantly getting Fnatic triggering vision plants almost as soon as they tried to place wards and getting swept out, and they just looked really, really poor in terms of early game vision and setups, and Xiaohu was continuously getting surprised in most of his matchups. So
I think a lot of Xiaohu, and correct me if I'm wrong as well, but it's just because it's just a speculative thing. I think he's super momentum based. And so as an example, at the start of the split, there was no Uzi. Once again, he came back after Chinese New Year, and it felt like Xiaohu was underperforming, almost like he didn't really care enough to want to be playing there. Like the old Xiaohu would have hard carried, but this time around, not so much. And he went through the split, and he had to have Karsa as well as mlxg. And he said in interviews that with Karsa, he didn't have to talk to Karsa, but with mlxg, he had to baby him a little bit more and, give him more directions. And I feel like perhaps with motivation being waning while waiting for Uzi, he started to suffer in his shot calling perhaps as well. And then he had like a big dip and came back towards the end of the split. But I feel like personally it was momentum from watching him decline like that.
Did you have something to add on there, Kelsey?
I was just going to say that he's, generally speaking, when he does have periods where he performs poorly, he's very vocal and self-critical, and does say that he thinks that like he doesn't practice enough during those times. So it could be momentum based, as you said.
Okay, good. Very Korean answer there. Just lack of practice. That's the only reason anyone would ever play bad. I've always loved that when they do that as well. It's like, come on, guys, you're already practicing 14 hours a day. I don't think it's the extra hour that was the problem in this match. When you watched RNG in the group stage, and obviously the group stage was a bit weird because there wasn't one team who just beat everyone, and there was actually a lot of parity, and ideal tournament for international fans of League of Legends because every day the best of ones brought us a totally different result. So then the people who hate that team could say, I knew they were trash all along, they'll never do anything. And then they got to have a day off, in the sun, while the other people, no, they're the best ever. Do you take anything from the losses they had against Flash Wolves or Team Liquid, teams that we didn't expect to be deep finishing teams here? Were there any warning signs in those or worrying moments at all? Because obviously by the time they got to the playoffs, these are some pretty concisive games.
I personally always thought that one of the biggest weaknesses of RNG has been their draft. And I do think that there are some things perhaps you could look at. And I would say the biggest one is that they've jumped 2 patches and their coaching staff weren't really sure how to adapt to it. So they just picked comfortable things.
Oh, right.
And I think,
can you give me an update then? Like what changed in that many patches? Like what was LPL doing that you couldn't bring over to MSI in that sense?
It was more that so Kaiser was a must pick or ban champion and Jhin didn't really exist. Uzi still can't play the Jhin first and foremost. So in certain matchups, there's times where he wasn't fully prepared. The Ezreal is the biggest one. That Ezreal existed, but Ezreal wasn't as strong as it was when he came to this tournament. It took them until the last day almost of the last round to actually start picking up the Ezreal and trying to get those things going. And I do think a lot of this, it's weird to say comfort and not mention his Ezreal, but what was working for them at the time was the obsession for them. In 8-6, you have to pick the Rakan first or you're losing the game. And without fail, they would be doing that here, and the other team would just pick the Ezreal and beat them. And I think they were just really concrete in what was working for them before until they learned what was the best here then.
I think, Israel maybe had less to do with the patch, but for me, also the big thing was the Yasuo. I would throw out the Yasuo. Xiaohu really even said publicly that he wasn't really sure on the matchup at all. He just wasn't used to it. So I think that was definitely a big thing as well. A lot of it was just, I expected RNG to perform fairly poorly after they're coming in 2 days before the tournament because of, the classic Chinese visa issue problem.
Yes.
So I actually didn't know what to expect from them, so I was really, really conservative about how they would do in general.
Why is China still behind on patches sometimes? Because obviously it was always this time of year, especially when it used to be noticeable. Famously that was with the first MSI, which was really all stars, when they had hadn't even played Morgana on their patch or something ridiculous, right? So why are they still behind, Kelsey?
It wasn't that they were behind. They actually played playoffs on a patch that was more advanced than the other teams played.
Okay.
Their playoffs on NAU.
That's even weirder.
But the issue is that it went from their tournament just ended much later. So suddenly they're playing on a new patch for MSI when the tournament basically just finished on another patch. And I'm not entirely sure what kind of quality of practice they would get because most of the Chinese teams would go home. And I'm not really sure what the Korean teams are doing or what anyone is doing. Most people are probably on holiday. So I'm not sure what kind of practice they would get at home without coming to MSI on the new patch as well. So
yeah, I will say that Chinese New Year was the biggest factor for this as well, as to why they were so late with their finals. And 2 weeks of time off is 2 weeks that they could have been preparing for the MSI tournament, perhaps came in a bit more prepared. And The other thing that is always going to persist, it seems, is in China, the government has to approve the patch before it's put out. Okay. So it's always going to be late, no matter what. And you just do not get the patch for another 2 weeks.
Thing is, I know what you mean by that, but the way you say that's as though like some government officials like, nah, they can't put this out. Fucking Yasuo's OP as fuck.
It's pretty consistently on par with the LCK patches, though. Like at this point, the patches are usually the same as the LCK patches within the LPL. The one exception would be the Chinese New Year changeover, just because obviously government holiday. Yes. So yeah.
Does that make it a more impressive feat to win the tournament, though? The patch combined with the playoffs ending a couple of days before. I mean, put it this way. If a Western team had a good result and they had those, you'd never hear the fucking end of it. It'd be in every Reddit post.
I think it is a big deal. Not the biggest of deals, of course. I think it's credit to RNG and actually being adaptable, being able to, again, being a team that can do that, of course, but coming into the later stages of the tournament and showing their growth very well. So absolutely, I think it's a bigger deal. And that's why it's also not a surprise that the group stage starts so shaky. And there is a chance that if they did come in with the 2 weeks of notice that they would still lose those games. But there's also still a chance that they would be able to clean sweep the start of the tournament as well from that.
Because the other factor as well is a lot of people would like, okay, say someone never saw this tournament and you just told them, you know, this is like, I mean, it's not the first time that China's beaten Korea, but I think it's the most notable one because for what people don't remember about the EDG versus SKT one is like, SKT didn't play their best player in one of the games. Like, shut the fuck up, everyone, please. Like, please stop referencing that as though it's like the most conclusive example of like China did beat Korea. Like, yeah, they also didn't put the best player of all time in the game, but we'll ignore that for a second. Even though that has happened, if you told me now that the Chinese team wins, like I think an obvious assumption if you know the way that MOBA games tend to work would be maybe they had something figured out about the meta, or maybe they defined the meta and other people had to catch up. Sounds like actually, to some degree, they were one of the teams that was playing catch up, right? And does this mean by the end they had it nailed and they kind of had a good read on it and they had the strengths that you could have within the meta?
I think the meta naturally suited them to an extent because the tournament trended more. And this is where I think Kingzone failed a lot, is where the meta trended significantly towards like counterpicking bot lane. And Kingzone, I don't know if they just obstinately refused to counterpick the support or whatever, but they opted into a lot of weird, like, not winning bot matchups so that they could have strong top, strong mid, right? Which is just obviously something they're much more comfortable with and something they're much more used to. So I think that the meta kind of naturally favored RNG. The other thing is that like there are ways where some of RNG's setups to ensure that they could always get like sideline pressure and transition it into team fights and then good like closeouts, I just think are better than a lot of teams, and so that helped them a lot. And that's not something that's going to change significantly unless you have something like eliminating lane swaps happening in a patch or something like that.
I think that's actually like when SKT go to an international tournament, you can think back to like Faker playing his Rise, of course. He completely defined what the tournament meta looked like. But for the first, the group stage of this tournament, there was no defining team, and because it was so close, I don't think the meta had fully cemented itself around a dominant Korean powerhouse team. And I think that is something that may have actually attributed to a lot of the tournament success and, teams playing their own style, sure. But it's also just Korea not destroying everyone and forcing them to play Korean style, which is where Koreans will win the tournament, obviously, because they're the best at it. I do think that's actually a contributing factor to it. And I think that maybe if SKT were in their best form and came to the tournament, the meta would be around them. But in this instance, the bottom lane was the biggest focal point, and Uzi is the best bottom laner.
What do you mean by Korean style? I will always say this whenever someone says this, no offense.
I'm referencing draft specifically in cases like this. So like when I do say Faker's Rise, it's the fact that a Rise then becomes a priority pick in the tournament, where like in this one, the Ezreal constantly gets picked, but it's against the Kaiser, or, they've got Zyra Khan into the cut. Like they've got matchups to try and combat one another. There isn't the be all end all. Like this is the meta, as the Koreans have picked 5 god tier Exodia champions that you have to follow. in the same way that it has in the past.
Would you say maybe Riot just balanced the patch slightly better, or?
Is this the fucking softball of all time?
I'm just saying, like, I don't know. I have a bit of an issue with, like, saying Korea comes in and defines the meta, because I feel like in a lot of international tournaments, it's been the opposite. And then the Korean team, like the dominant Korean team, has come in and just adapted faster. Like, obviously, some of the best examples are the way that Europe came in 2015 with like the TP lanes, and the way that I guess you would say the NA came in at MSI in 2016 with the sport matchups and stuff like this. It's like, for me, it's not that Korea forces other regions or other teams to adapt to them. It's just like something will rise up that's clearly better, and then unless people figure out counters to it, everyone has to adapt to it, and Korean teams, or like the best Korean team, ends up adapting faster. So
I do agree to an extent there. Like I think that some things are defined by them, but other things, as you mentioned, is adapted incredibly well from them. And I think to like the Xayah and the Misfortune supports that from Worlds as well. Like no one saw that coming, but there's been rumors of it, and of course they are the first ones to bring it out, and they're very successful with it. I think that adaptability is also a part of the defining of it. However, moving through the rest of the tournament, where like they definitely don't come in guns blazing like Flash Wolves did in this tournament and then start to drop off a little bit. I think they slowly work their way into it, but at the end of the tournament, they have the best recipe for success.
So since a lot of the themes already that we've discussed have centered around the bottom lane, and that was the obvious on-paper narrative of the tournament, was you had all these really good AD carries, even like historically big names, not like they're just the hot property at the moment. It was obviously set up to be a perfect battle in that sense. So what do you make of VeXii over the tournament and in the final?
I mean, Uzi's definitely a genius in his role, and he has been for a long time. But for me, for Uzi and for the bottom lane in general at this tournament, we saw different styles trying to clash against one another. And I think that's where a lot of the context does need to be cemented there. It's Uzi definitely the best AD carry at the tournament, perhaps in the world, of course. I know he's been argued for even in the list for best player of all time, but fake, titles, blah, blah, blah. He wins lane, right? Like Uzi just wins lane. And that's his style. Ming protects him. Xiaohu protects. Like Uzi is always going to be on that pedestal, and Prey is the opposite of that. And I think that was the coolest thing about this tournament. It's, can you soak pressure against, can you force pressure in these lanes, and how does that actually meet in the middle, and what will be more successful? I think that was one of the coolest things about the entire thing through that bottom lane specifically. And like Uzi was great. AD carries were great. I would still be personally talking about the supports, because I just think they were stellar in their own ways.
Kelsey, whenever people, I've noticed this, unfortunately, is just a trend with how media does the narratives around sports. It's like anyone who's really criticized, when they then do win the big game, like magically the same person who's criticizing them becomes like the number one cheerleader. Oh, they've done everything I said they needed to do. Now they're the best. Like, obviously, you've been someone who at times was critical of VeXii. You certainly credited when he has that evolution. Where would you put where he's at the moment and in this tournament?
Yeah, I mean, I do think he's playing better than he ever has. I think that someone has suggested, I don't know, it was someone on Twitter, not anyone in particular, just said, well, I think VeXii is the best player of all time. And I said, well, I think it's dishonest at this point to call him that, because you're just, and also a disservice to him, because it's not acknowledging like the major growth that he has made, to just say that he was always like going to be this insane, right? And I think that, for example, RNG have continuously been characterized as a team fighting team, and I think that team fighting is something that they do really, really well. And obviously a lot of that comes down to VeXii, but I still think of this team as like a team that sets up siege and balances pressure across lanes like extremely well in mid to late game. And I think it's really telling that their most decisive game was actually the game where they played a 1-3-1 comp with like Vlad and Shen, and didn't team fight and just kept like forcing Kingzone into that position. So I think, and in those scenarios, VeXii plays like extremely good disengage. He has good placement on the map. He's not like going all in. He's able to play a bunch of different roles extremely well as an AD carry, and we're not in a position where I think, okay, if the meta shifts drastically away from bot lane, UCI is just going to completely collapse, whereas I would have maybe had that idea in the past because he'll just continue to play aggressively regardless. So I think that UCI has made like significant developments, and I think he's really, really earned the accolades that he's gained recently. So
I mean, old Uzi just dies in a side lane 100 times. There's no such thing as the 1-3-1, right? There is him overextending, split pushing, and just dying. And he has gotten a lot smarter. He's matured a lot more, and he's actually shown that he can play for the team and not just have the team play for him. And I think that is the biggest commendations that you could possibly give to him, is that he's actually grown up. Like after 6 years, he's hit 21. He's finally matured into a classy player.
Okay. Kelsey, what about this then? Because one of the issues I always had, again, with the way that narrative's constructed, is it is a narrative around one player, and it is obviously a team game. And as much as everyone wishes in the movie that you would win when you finally became, like you learned the secret of teamwork or whatever the fuck bullshit narrative would be in the movie and like, the final act, in reality, he could have won LPL years ago. Or, I mean, obviously he couldn't really have won Worlds because, like, let's be real, those teams were always underdogs when they got to the finals in all those scenarios. Maybe he could have last year. That was maybe like the first legit chance to. Does winning now and winning LPL as well coincide with like the zenith of his growth? Was he already good enough to have basically won the titles that would have already brought about some of this narrative change in how people talked about him already in the past? What do you think?
I think so. There are obviously some circumstances in UCI's past that are really unfortunate. Like he is the only player that was on both teams that forfeited playoffs, and a bunch of other situations which may or may not be coincidences. But the reality is that when I'm saying like he's evolved as a player, I'm not saying, oh, he just became a team player and, he learned how to help his teammates and not be such an asshole all the time. What I'm really saying is that like his positioning on the map and his understanding of pressure has evolved significantly to the point where if the jungler isn't constantly in his lane, he's not going to like jump into 5 people and have like the highest deaths of any AD carry in the league or something like this, So his just like understanding of the game and what he can do to create pressure in various circumstances has just evolved. And he's like also a leader, right? He's also able to be in positions where he's taking responsibility. He's not saying like, one of the lines that stuck out to me in the release MSI showcase for Eyes on UZI or whatever was when he says, I will dive the back line. And Let Me says, really? And he's like, yes, it's the only way we win the team fight, Like he is taking this kind of responsibility, right? So yeah.
He's pulling out like Infinity Wall now, apparently. So,
exactly.
Okay.
So yeah. It's just like this kind of like more calm, like assuredness, whereas before would be like I remember, I think if you want to contrast, it's like his famous 2013 game against OMG where everyone's going ham on him, and of course he's like insanely fed, but he's rolling around on Vayne and like auto attacking everyone, and like the entire time all he's saying is, I haven't died, I still haven't died, oh my god, I didn't die. So it's just like a certain, in these more high tense situations, like you can kind of see his attitude toward them becoming much more focused.
Okay. So obviously the next team we will talk about will be Kingzone Dragon X. So when I ask this question, I'm mainly slanting it towards the RNG player side of it. But when you say that the choices they made in the draft, particularly around the bottom lane, seems primarily to have been, as you'd expect from Praying Gorillas, obviously one of the famous strengths they have is to allow the top lane, for example, to pick whatever he wants or to get a counter pick or, to get the natural strength that you would want, not least because it's a very unique luxury to have at the moment. Not a lot of people can run the game that way. In doing so, obviously it's going to put more focus on that particular matchup, which already had this whole narrative around it where some people thought Karn was the best player in all of League of Legends. Now, again, looking mainly at the RNG side now, because we'll definitely talk about him, obviously, when we break down Kingzone. Obviously, people who came in with a lot of hype for him would not think that Let Me would be able to do anything. They would assume this would be someone who'd roll over. Did Let Me perform particularly well in the series they played in the finals?
I mean, Let Me had a very specific job in the finals, and I think that he played the job at most points very well. There are some times where, they're coming to the turret and he overextends himself, and that's one of the Ornn problems, I will say, as a result of picking the champion, is he wants to just clear the wave, use the ultimate, and then it's too late and they're already there diving him because it's a cannon wave, or he just, one laps in judgment. I think that overall, though, Let Me did have one of the best tournaments of his career, and for the first time out of China, that's a big surprise for him. And he started to ramp up towards the end of the tournament to be a lot better than opposed to the start of it, I think, where he was a bit slow to start.
I mean, as far as I know, Kelsey, aside from the context that you said before, like just why you thought they should have brought the sub top laners as ties for stylistic reasons, you have always been something of a supporter of Let Me, right?
I think that it's kind of weird to me that people were extremely down on Let Me going into this tournament when he was like the surprise of him in 957. I think in particular were some of the surprises of the Worlds tournament, right? Where no one expected them to perform extremely well, and everyone was just like shocked by how well they did. And then going into this tournament, I was like, yeah, well, Let Me's basically a dog. He's not gonna, do anything that special. He's just gonna get rolled over by everyone. All he plays is tanks. I legit listened to a podcast that will remain nameless where they did analyze RNG as like their top laners. All they do is play tanks, So I think...
But that was mainly just because of the meta at Worlds, right?
Well, I think it was also just they said that that's all RNG do in general, is that they just mindlessly 5v5 and they have worse macro than NA. But
So basically 5-year-old opinions from different teams applied to a current team that has one player the same. Okay, cool. Well, same script for NA podcasts currently, so fair enough.
But it was So it was surprising to me that like Let Me was surprising to people. Like I thought that he had a good tournament, but it wasn't. I didn't necessarily think that he performed better or worse than I expected. Right? Khan had some issues, but they were also things that were exaggerated forms of problems that he'd had in the past as well. So it was all very strange in general. I think the issue more with like Prey Gorilla. What you mentioned is the more intriguing one, and the way that they use top lane pressure and everything else is the more intriguing question to ask about Kingzone. But I'll let you get to your next point.
Sure. Okay, so the one last question I had on the RNG topic is this, right? Even though obviously no one can really make any reasonable predictions based on a tournament now in May of what will happen in September, October. Like it would be hard enough in any esport, but in an esport where you get to see one tournament that's international, it's pretty much impossible. So it's just for fun, just for speculation. Assuming Kingzone doesn't drastically shore up whatever issues they had or make some incredible growth as people and overcome whatever issues some of them seem to have in international tournaments, would this RNG team, should they reasonably expect it to be a favourite for Worlds? Could this be the Chinese team that wins Worlds?
I would say yes. Of course, that does depend on how time changes things, but this RNG, and I actually echoed Kelsey towards the end of the split as well, thought that they would peak in summer, not in spring. And I do have my speculations that if they're going to continue to get better as this split progresses, then they should absolutely be the favorites coming into Worlds.
Okay. Kelsey, it's safe to say it this time. 2015 is a long time ago. The narratives have died, sort of.
Obviously, I think that there can be major changes to the meta, and if you've seen some of the items on PvE, maybe I still kind of feel like RNG at 2017 Worlds looked as good as they did because it was still a ball lane centric meta. But and because of Ardent, and they just abused that way better than a ton of teams. But I do think that overall, RNG should definitely be considered favorites for Worlds, or like one of the favorites. Let's put it this way. Like, there's no way that, in my head, there's no way that this team like completely drops out of the conversation. Based on, especially like one thing we haven't really hit on is how decisive I felt that the MSI final was. relative to some of the projections from everyone on the desk. Even like Jat and Frost predicted 3-2. Papa predicted 3-2 the other way. So everyone predicted 5 games. And but even the game that RNG lost, I felt like was basically in their hands at a point. And the final game that they won was probably the closest game of the series overall. So,
okay. What about this then? Before we just go fully into the Kingzone thing, in a world where we played this final over again, and obviously we mean like literally run it back, like we don't have the same knowledge of what happened and no one's reacting to that. Does RNG win this most of the times based on what you saw?
I would say so. If you to pit them, let's say, against each other 100 times and see what the outcome is, I'd still give it as a maybe 80% to RNG with just how they were playing compared to them. So that would be 80 out of the 100, right? Like there's still worlds where Kingzone win for sure, but I would give heavy favorites to RNG.
Even when Longju was projected to win Worlds last year, it was like the dominant team coming out of LCK. It's like you can still see restrictions in how they play. So for me, I think that RNG had more options for answering them. So it's just hard for, like, having seen the games, obviously, going in, it's a bit of a different story. But having seen the games, I think now that it feels like RNG would win the majority of their matchups. So yes.
Okay. Right, let's get into Kingzone then, because the thing with Kingzone is it would be a very different story if that last question I just asked there was different because, you know, the team had been dominant the whole tournament. It's only in the final they lost. But obviously, they had some shaky moments when they were in the group stage. In fact, even in some of the games they won, there were times where it was like, what the fuck's going on here? And there would be a 5-minute period where it looked a bit iffy, you know. But they still got out in fine fashion. They beat Flash Wolves, admittedly, not exactly world beaters in best of 5 format, unfortunately. Very famously a best of 1 team. And then in the final, obviously, they have underwhelmed and they've lost, letting down something of the tradition in Korea. Let's go into some of the things you hinted at before then. What were the major flaws of Kingzone here? Because it sounds like we're going to start, actually, not with just a specific player's performance, where everyone obviously starts and ends on Reddit, but some of the stylistic choices, the strategic choices, right?
I think that there are very specific things that Kingzone do in order to make sure that their top lane gets ahead, and one is just like their bottom lane is very good at the 2v2, and obviously we're not talking about the same sense of like they go into Smash, but I think that they are still potentially on a good day like at least the second best laning bot lane in the world, because like Prey is really, really good at finding and identifying holes or finding opportunities. Gorilla plays some engage, but I think like Prey's sense overall, he's just like very dominating and very good at being self-sufficient within the laning phase. Gorilla is very good at using that to get vision across the map so that they as a 2v2 can continue to basically on their own pressure their opponents. So I think that that's very strong. However, if you're able to target that or upset that, it becomes very difficult. It became very difficult at 2017 Worlds for them to execute like very, very hard side lane push compositions because of the way that they're approaching it, in a sense where, okay, we need to get pressure mid first so that our side lanes are freed up to continue to push out all the way. Whereas I think the way RNG look at it is we need to get pressure in sides first so that UZI can soft reset the mid wave and he never has to overextend and he's safe as can be until Baron spawns and we still get vision and we still have pressure. So I think that that's a bit of a contrast here, which means that if you're looking at Kingzone, the best way to attack them is mid, because if they can't, their bot lane, because if they can't get pressure mid in the mid to late game, then their side lanes fall apart. So this was a problem that they had at Worlds. I think an adaptation that they have made throughout spring is that they don't really hard side lane anymore. They push waves to river on top and bot, and then they group mid and they team fight way more, which is why it kind of looks why they gravitated more towards the Cho'Gath after the Fiora didn't work out. Is because they didn't want to play like the hard side lane nearly as much as they maybe had in the past. So I think that that's an issue that Kingzone as a team are still grappling with, and that's sort of the symptom, because Khan has struggled, and the team in general has struggled with setting up team fight flanks, has struggled with using teleports. So I think that they're, as a team, still growing and still adapting to different types of strategies and different ways to execute what they've decided is the best way to play the game. So,
okay, what do you think, Rusty? What flaws did you see in Kingzone?
I mean, I do think that they're a team that will continue to get better with time as well, because a lot of their flaws do seem to be it's not from being, in their infancy as players, but as a team, understanding how to win every single game. Personally, this could be weird and it may not be entirely true. I don't think they were always challenged in the LCK to have to do these different strategies. Like the Cho'Gath coming around is a good thing, but a late adaptation that wasn't really something they needed to do all the time during the split, because they're not often challenged in the LCK, whereas like RNG, again, to contrast it with Challenge Act, they sucked for the first 5 weeks and they really got it together. So they had to learn how to do all of these new things. For me, I really like the bottom lane as a place to look. I don't necessarily think that they were weak, but I think that they're a place that were getting actively exploited through the tournament and there was no real support for them. I think that the reason they were exploited, however, is because of Peanut a lot of the time just being hard pressured, being hard shut down and shut out of the map completely. And whether he's dying or not doesn't matter. There's times where he looks super smart and he isn't dying, but his not dying doesn't actually save the bottom lane from their inevitable death 2 minutes later when the vision is already in place for a teleport down there, right? Like, I think that the jungle role may actually be the place that I would look at first. Okay. And say that's the thing that should be explored the most. And whether it's draft or the player tendencies or styles, it was something in that role.
So obviously, Kelsey, one of the reasons why when we get to the Khan thing, I do think some of it's overblown because it is like his second international tournament ever, It's a bit quick to just write someone off completely. And obviously, the last one was with a different jungler. This one's with Peanut. Now, the problem with Peanut has always been when he is amazing, everyone's like, holy shit, imagine if he just did this all the time. It's like, yeah, well, yes, he'd be the best fucking jungler you could ever want. But when he isn't amazing, he is not amazing in almost a similar fashion. What do you think were the flaws in this end? Because obviously he's someone himself who's had his own, funnily enough, actually somewhat separated from even the Rock's core. Obviously he had his time when he was in past team. He's had his own issues at times in playoff type scenarios. So what did you think his impact or lack thereof was in this tournament and for Kingzone?
I think there are times where Peanut and mlxg are good junglers to compare because they will both do things that are very bold on occasion and don't always work out, where Peanut will go for like some of the more aggressive plays and he's known as being like the living ward or whatever, whereas I think a lot of junglers just do not expect this kind of thing from him. And so it's interesting to see him kind of lose some of that confidence occasionally as well. I think that there were definitely some issues where where Kingzone looked best was definitely for me still the fourth game against RNG, where he finally gets the tempo ahead of Karsa. He's going down and he's making sure that he's consistently playing off of the fact that they ward bot first, right? They're able to keep pressuring the fact that he has vision control of bot. He gets the scuttle on bot before Karsa does. So they eventually figured out how they want to play with advanced tempo, and that was something that was a strength for them domestically for very long, was just Peanut played tempo way better, but it was just kind of, he was finding his footing for way too long at this tournament, and he was off for way too long at this tournament. So for me, the biggest difference between how Kingzone were domestically and how they were at MSI was, as Rusty said it, way more on Peanut than on Khan. So.
Okay, because I do feel like it's weird how some people just miss out on certain patterns themselves. If you actually think over the last, realistically, you'd have to say the last, I'd say 5 splits even, Peanut has always been fabulous in the regular split of LCK. In fact, probably, off the top of my head, he must have either had the top KDA for jungler or second. Maybe Score had a better 1-for-1 split, but then again, Score plays for KT Rolster, so that takes care of that in the playoffs. But you look generally in playoff settings, obviously he isn't as sick as that. And so in some senses, he's part of the reason probably why his team's in, because you're getting such a sample size, it wouldn't normally make sense. He is on top of the LCK junglers, especially because LCK actually doesn't have that crazy a jungle pool and hasn't for a number of years. Obviously, a lot of the big names went abroad to earn a lot of money elsewhere. And so I've always felt like a flaw actually of Koreans, because I've noticed this even when I used to follow StarCraft Brood War, is when they think there's a meta in place and when they think someone's better than them, they are so bad for sort of like playing out what's a losing script where you're like slightly worse than the other guy and you're doing like the correct thing to what he's doing, but he's slightly ahead of you and is better than you. And it's like you lose and you did everything right. So the coach is like, okay, you did a good job. But it's like sometimes in those scenarios, you actually want someone to do some seemingly bizarre, stupid shit even. That's like actually sometimes the counter to the guy who's the best.
Yeah, I think like the Hail Mary, so to speak, from the losing situations are sometimes necessary for sure. And I actually agree that a lot of the Korean mantra is to continue to play perfectly. And I think to come back to the matchup, even in the finals for Kingzone, they chose to play Karsa against them RNG, and he chose to play the Skana. You know, you've got your Shrine or your Spire in the river, so Scuttle Crab control is a pretty good place to be fighting. And often Peanut doesn't find himself there at the correct times for that. And it's like, well, Peanut, he's lost the Scuttle. Like, yeah, in game 4, a little bit of extra control, but looking at games 1 and 3, loses control of the jungle and he's 1% behind, and now he's 2% behind. And then suddenly the game starts to slowly shut out. And Peanut's one of the few junglers that can make the aggressive decisions, but in the pressing situations like the playoffs, I don't think that he does. I do think that he's cautious and tries to, you know, be a bit more reserved and suffers from that.
You know something, Rusty? If I actually had you say the name of the champion Kaiser and the name of the jungler Karsa like 100 times, alternating between the two, I don't know who would break first, mate. I think all of us collectively. Luckily, the context was different enough. Yes, it's okay.
I forget the name of the player in the play-ins tournament, but there was someone there who has the exact same name as an item, I think it was. And no, it was Roki. And there's a player in the LPL, Rookie, that sounds the exact same when I say it, regardless. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's very obnoxious.
So, when you look at the jungle issues here then, Kelsey, right, this is another problem with obviously the Longdew story, was that was the easiest way to explain away the problems that they had at Worlds. Like I even said, it's kind of fucking mad that they won the LCK with like probably the worst player to ever play in an LCK final in Cuz. So it's a bit underwhelming if players who sometimes separately have issues with choking or underperforming internationally then get a player who seemingly makes the team stronger, who also has his own issues, and then they collectively flop. What does that kind of... Do you have omens for the future that this is that's like, it's one thing if one player has to improve or you have to tweak something. That sounds like a lot has to kind of be fixed.
I think when the change was announced and that Peanut would be joining the, Kingzone, excuse me, they have so many different names, team, I wrote an article that was Peanut will improve their strengths but not fix their weaknesses, because I
still love it when you used to write articles. That was the golden days. Anyway, yeah, keep going.
But not fix their weaknesses, and I feel like we kind of saw that a little bit, just in terms of they're still finding ways to try to play around the same overarching issues that they had at Worlds, and Peanut is maybe in some cases making them look like really daring and really aggressive, but at other times just kind of flopping along with them or not necessarily giving them alternatives in situations where they're already feeling pressured. So,
okay. So then obviously one of the topics everyone will want to discuss, because it was the easiest bandwagon for everyone to jump on, was Khan was... I mean, people would probably say a shitter. He failed. He let the career down. And obviously, a context that this comes in from is he did make those like bold statements of like, you know, all the top laners will bow before me, you know, that sort of shit, you know, which, to be fair, come on, man, it is Koreans like being told to trash talk. Like, I don't think he literally just looks at his fucking in the mirror every day, just like, you're so beautiful and fucking that's best talk. Like, you know, if I know Koreans, like, come on, it's not that serious, is it? Like, it's not like if a Western player said it, like, no one's prompting them to say it. Obviously, yes, it was a very underwhelming performance. And if you really were the god top laner you're built to be, I think you probably should win out in these scenarios. So what do you make of Khan's failings?
I mean, there's a couple of games where he did have a really good power in
still had
here
a
and
few
there.
snowball games. But
yeah, there was a couple where he still
also
was,
vice versa.
Exactly. He was hit and miss regarding his performances, and I think that for me, looking at Khan, I don't mind when someone trash talks. I actually love when they trash talk. For a Korean to do it, it's adorable in the first place because, you know, they're trying really hard to find it deep within them to say something nasty, and they can't always quite get it done. But yeah, he had good performances. I think overall there are some flaws within Khan as a player that very rarely come about. I think a lot of this does still stem, however, through the rest of the map and how it can be influenced. If he chooses to split push, as an example, usually there'll be vision to support him, or at least vision of the rest of the enemy team, so that he'll know when to step up. And to, you know, against his credit, he was stepping up inappropriately at times, but there's also, in the perfect world scenario, that was the correct time to step up in his mind, and he made the mistake because the vision was lacking elsewhere or something of the likes. And I think that in his mind, he'll know that he played poorly, but if he looks at his own decision making, he probably doesn't believe that it was incorrect. And that's where it's like, it's a very vague thing to try and explain, but if I am pushing bottom lane, I'm going to get a turret. I'm pushing top lane, I'm going to get a turret, so they have to choose between us. That death is sometimes worth it if you get a turret on the opposite side of the map, right? Like, that's the thing where the viewers will be like, man, this guy sucks. Look at him dying all the time, where there may actually be a decision behind it that can be justified. And I think that's something that may take a bit of the pressure off him.
I like to call Khan the UZI of the top lane. So if you're aware,
second best player of all time, cool, nice, we saw that one.
So if you're aware of how I kind of referred to UZI and pushed back a lot on some of his flaws in the earlier stages of his career, the first few years or whatever, then like I can say similar things about Khan, or I feel like he expects the jungler to almost always be there, right? He's used to having this consistent level of pressure. He will take these types of trades, but I don't even necessarily think those are his biggest flaws. More of his bigger flaws come from when it's time to group, does he always get like the right angle in the flank? Are his teleports always timed well with the rest of the team? And these are just things that I feel like he has made genuine progress with this spring in the LCK, but it's just high pressure situations. You're literally going to a tournament where you're talked yourself up so much, you expect yourself to do well, and you're falling apart. And so some of the stuff that you've been working on recently might not immediately come to you, or might not immediately like click in your head and show up on stage. So I think that some of these issues became very exaggerated throughout the tournament.
Okay. I will say, by the way, for all the people, because I did see the usual bunch rewriting history and being like, I always said Smeb was the best top laner in LCK. You know what? This would be the ideal time for you to link to the article where you wrote that after the split, because then you'd look like a fucking genius. Everyone would have to hail you. Oh, what's that? Even you didn't write the article because you didn't have the courage of your own convictions. Oh, well, back to twitter.com we all go before we all get banned and censored. Right, here's the question though. One of the things I do have to say that did feel like it exacerbated how bad this looked is it's not like when you look at the tournament, Khan can say he didn't get the champions he wanted. He got literally everything he wanted, and he even got at times, obviously, to pull out like the style points champion and just do stupid shit like he did against the Flash Wolves in some of the picks, etc. So there's not really any excuse for this performance, right?
I have a hard time coming up with an excuse for him for certain, in terms of, you know, he played the champions that he wanted to play. He got the matchups that he wanted to have, and he was able to, you know, set himself up to succeed in that respect. So if you're looking at draft, I would never say that there's an excuse for him there. I do think that the teleports and the other stuff and sometimes the intangibles that you don't see and could be communication with the team would be the bigger issues that they should be exploring moving forwards, and you can't find an excuse for that.
Sure. Because obviously, I think to me, one of the big questions coming out of this now is, unless Khan fixes it all and somehow doesn't have these issues, I have to say, traditionally, if you're someone who has those problems, I always say this, like, that's the last problem I'd ever want to have to deal with, because when you're dealing with someone's mind, it's like, who the fuck knows how you're going to fix that, or if they can fix it themselves? You know, it's obviously the most difficult temperamental thing to deal with, as opposed to if you fix something in the game, that is absolutely plausible to fix. So in a world in which he doesn't somehow overcome all these issues and therefore it's all moot, is it not an issue, Kelsey, that going forwards, this sort of totally changes the way people will think about Kingzone? Because before, it was the opposite. They actually used Khan as the strength, and the logic was, since they can shore up every other part of the map, if you then can't deal with this top laner, and at best sort of like soak up some of this pressure, you're just fucked. That was like actually the logic most people had in LCK, and then going into that. If he doesn't get over these issues, it's going to completely change the plan of attack, right?
Yeah, I mean, a big thing, again, I think is just he relies a lot on being able to have consistent, like their bot lane be able to hold mid very, very well for him, so he can keep split push pressure, so that he can have an easier time joining, like with tempo, if he's doing these teleports, like on the side of the map where they're strong, etc., etc. I think that if he needs to figure out how to play in those situations where the team needs to retool how they're looking at the map in every scenario. So
it is obviously, I mean, the way I'm about to say this now just shows that there will always be a gap in League of Legends, because a Korean team made the final of MSI and everyone's talking like they're absolute shit and have underwhelmed them massively. Meanwhile, final of MSI, the best anyone has ever managed from the West, and pretty much the zenith of all their careers who've done so. So were there positives within the Kingzone performance? Like, were there things that made you think you don't write them off and maybe they can go back to LCK, have a great split again, come into Worlds, and we'll all forget about this, and then everyone will, all the LCK fans will say, well, Worlds counts more than MSI. You know, the classic reframing. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for me, looking at this, I think there are some positives that you could take away from them. I think the first positive is that they lost. I think that's actually the biggest thing that they should be taking coming into summer as well. And this will be on them to improve from that defeat. But now they know what it's like. They aren't just the dominant team. They've tasted it even on international stage. And if they can correct the course, then they will be much more mature in how they approach the coming playoffs and finals again. And that actually helps so much for going into the internationals once more. Just having that experience and knowing what defeat actually feels like for themselves. And it is weird to say that that may be the biggest thing that you can take away from it, but that's certainly a truth that very rarely does get to be experienced when you're a top team. And, you know, in the LPL, IG hopefully is the exact same thing. So I think losing is a big deal. And I'm happy to see that they are able to, you know, go down ultimately in this one and not in Worlds, if it is seen as the bigger deal in the first place, which I personally still feel like it is for all of the teams competing.
I think I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement, because at least for players like Prey and Gorilla, they've been to tournaments where they're insanely bigged up and not succeeded. Peanuts had a similar experience. Even BDD and Khan have experienced this at Lost Worlds when they got swept by Samsung. So I don't necessarily know if just losing is a blanket benefit at this point, but if I talk about positives for Kingzone, I would just look at the spring LCK split, because I do think that they are slowly exploring options of how to play differently, which when they immediately hit, even through their dominant splits, so like if they continue to do that, if they immediately hit a wall next time, then maybe they're not as doomed. Or maybe they don't unravel as quickly as they did at this tournament, which, by the way, I'm exaggerating that a little bit, because I feel like these guys, they were pretty tenacious, even though they had issues throughout the group stage. There were only 2 teams that didn't manage to take a game off them. So, yeah.
Did the meta contribute to Kingzone losing?
I think a bit. I wouldn't say a crazy amount, but it was like what we mentioned a little bit before. It was a bottom lane focused style of meta, and they were trying not necessarily to draft even for a winning bottom lane as much as just picking stronger champions to scale through it. And there are times where that can be exploited for sure, but to me, looking at the meta, I think this was one of the most diverse tournament metas that we have had. You could pick multiple styles in nearly every role, barring perhaps the jungle position, which was more bottlenecked into trying to counter your opponent. So I don't think the meta contributed a crazy amount, but it existed, particularly for the bottom lane.
I do think the bottom lane 2-item AD thing was kind of a big deal overall, and the fact that teams were able to like force around item spikes or pay much more attention to their bottom lane was something that even Kingzone had issues with in playoffs, right? Because playoffs was when we saw like the Rage Blade buff and everything else. So that was the first patch, and we saw them play one series on it, and they didn't look super convincing against the Afrika Freaks, at least not to the extent that everyone expected, right? So
Yes.
I think that there is some meta issues that we can attribute to this as well.
Obviously, Prey is very famous for his Ezreal. It is one of his best one of his signature champions of all time. I mean, obviously, it was a different champion at different points in time, but it's one of the champions associated with him. Was it a flaw for them to not ever pick it onto him and to just let Uzi get it so many games in the final?
Oh, it's interesting actually that was the case. I think even from what we saw in the mic check, RNG was slightly surprised that they were getting the options of the AD carries there. I think that a lot of it was blue and red side there. So being on red side, you don't get the choice of the AD carry, and they were only banning one of them. So perhaps bottlenecked into the counter matchup.
Kingzone opted into to red side as well, was the thing. So they obviously had a plan. I think red side should allow them to counterpick AD, so maybe that's what they were going for, because UZI was picking Caitlyn into Ezreal, and they did that in the first game, for example. So, and they went for Varus into Ezreal, and they tried to get like matchups, at least from the AD perspective, that could do well, but I think they were actually weirdly more let down by their support picks. So.
Okay, so this is something we touched on before, so now let's bring it up. Like, actually, when I asked earlier in the RNG section, Rusty, about the AD carries, you actually said that to you it was about the supports, and then obviously you referenced within the draft context. So what was the storyline here?
I mean, so that was, a lot of that was in context of RNG as well, and the tournament started off with like the must-pick Rakan, regardless of anything. Doesn't matter what happens, if Rakan exists, you have to pick it, and that was something that was very set for them, and something that perhaps started to get attacked a little bit more. And I think once Malzahar became meta in the mid lane, RNG have said that they don't like picking the Rakan into it, so take the Rakan away, then they start to stretch themselves for options. And I think that was the point where RNG like worked themselves in a circle and realized that they can pick different support champions for, you know, the same purpose of the Rakan. Where I think that for the side of Kingzone, for the support role specifically, they were very just happy to pick to scale or to pick to survive the lane a bit more. They would pick the Rakan if the Zarya was there, but I don't think they put too much focus on counterpicking. And counterpicking for a support role, influencing an entire bottom lane when you've already got a strong AD carry, I think is one of the strongest things you can do in any draft phase that influences so much of the map. But I very rarely saw that.
Okay. So Kelsey, what did you think then of, I have to say actually, of all the players in Kingzone, Gorilla is one of the only ones win their incredibly dominant LCK split who actually did get some flack throughout the split, and people thought he wasn't because obviously the problem is he has such a historic name. People who don't watch want to just think, if his team's at the top, he must still be the best support player in the world. In fact, actually, I think most times I ever discussed it with Emily, she thought he wasn't the best support in the LCK. In fact, obviously we had Mata, we had Tusin, we had a bunch of talent actually at that point in time. Was Gorilla a problem here? Was it more that Ming was better than people expect? Which side on the equation would you come down on?
I've always been kind of like, because Gorilla and Prey have been together for so long, I've always given way more credit to Prey, just watching their laning phase and how he seems to exert more control in the lane than I expect from most ADs, because especially in early laning, usually it's led by the support, right? So for me, I've always kind of seen Gorilla as someone who plays off of Prey's pressure, and it's occasionally difficult to do that on mages. Obviously, he was always well known for his Janna, And so I just think that maybe it was a bit of a back and forth for him. Like, I guess I wasn't completely let down by his performance, but I've never been one of those people who thinks that Gorilla is like absolutely the best bar none support in the world as well. So
okay. Do you think that when Kingzone go home, they do just win the LCK again, and it's like all of this just gets erased and they go back to whatever form they were in before? Obviously, it's a slightly different game, but do they just go back and pound everyone again?
I always wonder after losing the international. I mentioned that perhaps losing could be good for them, but I don't think it will be at the very start. I have a feeling that they're not going to look as dominant as they did, and some other teams may actually start to challenge them. They've potentially learned a lot from this event as a team. The individuals, of course, like you mentioned before, Kelsey, they have had their defeats, but if the team goes back and grows, then by the end of the split, perhaps they still have the capabilities there to dominate once again. But then, just like we mentioned with the LPL, there's a chance that teams start to get more dominant towards the end of summer, and maybe SKT finds themselves a free kick and continue to improve, whatever it may be. There's always a chance that they get challenged even more so coming into what is always perceived as the most important split.
Okay.
Based on notes on PBE, I actually think it's very, very likely that the meta will swing into Kingzone's favor. So, yeah, maybe they just dominate.
One thing I've noticed that's actually a bit strange about Kingzone and Longju before them is that unlike other very successful Korean teams, you almost never in the Western media ever hear a word said about their coaching staff. I bet most people watching this episode right now could not even name who the head coach of the Kingzone team is. I bet so many could not. Well, here's the question I have is, when a team is as dominant as they were in these two splits, and especially this last one, I actually find it super hard to even vaguely gauge what the coach is doing. Because, for example, this last split, I thought it was the most ridiculous one ever because I can't even tell it was a good draft because they seemed like the most OP team ever because everyone basically could always get a champion they wanted anyway and no one really could fuck with them as a team. So it's like, how do I know if that's a good draft? Like, I always thought that was the stupidest part about international tournaments where people are like praising like the super dominant SK Telecoms, like the draft was amazing. It's like, how the fuck would any of us know? I mean, like, if the other team can't play those champions, it's irrelevant, isn't it? Like, if I have all the Pokemon and I pick the best ones, it doesn't really matter in that scenario, does it? So, do you have any information or any guess or speculation on the coaching staff of Longju? Because obviously that is a factor that's not really getting weighed up here. We're all just bagging on the players.
I mean, I think a lot of young players on teams have a tendency to at least talk about their coach, but with Kingzone, it's almost always Prey and Gorilla, right? Those are the players that
they are the Mythi in G2.
Yeah. They're the players that the other players talk about. So I don't know. I don't really know. They've kind of gone through like a few different coaches, so it's really hard to say.
Okay.
Yeah. I think one of them just recently got picked up in the LPL as well, but I didn't even really know who he was before getting picked up. I just knew that he was a Longzhu coach at one stage. For the coaching stuff, no, honestly, you don't hear about them. You do hear more about the players themselves, and maybe they're just there because, and this is the speculation part, because they're like the father figures, right? They're the necessary experienced members to keep the mentalities in check. But even then, what do Prey and Gorilla do if they're not that themselves, as they've been around for so long? So I really don't know.
Okay. Right, Kelsey, just before we move off the Kingzone topic, I did want to just ask you this question because it's one that's like a historical narrative that did rise up again. The people that bizarrely got focused on, what I noticed was interesting was when people were blaming people, yes, they blamed Peanut, they blamed Calm primarily. I said he kind of made his own bed in that one, so, get fucked, like, fair enough. But I noticed a lot of people also focused on the fact that Prey and Gorilla lost again. And obviously, first of all, yeah, they haven't won the international tournament. And then, to me, it's actually even a bit more egregious that they've been in so many teams that have lost so many finals, because it's not like they're the guys that, like KT players that lost all the finals, but they lost all the finals. They've also won a whole bunch. Like, to actually have won that many titles and yet be sort of famous for being a loser is a bit bizarre. So does this in any way tie into a narrative that they somehow lose or aren't as good in these scenarios? Are they somehow separated in this one and some of the past ones? Because I have to say, personally, in some of the past Worlds, for example, I thought sometimes they got a bit unfairly tarred with that just because they were the ones with the longest track record, you know?
So Emily had a good point on this, where she said that she thinks that if they aren't expected to do well, like there's less pressure on them, and they've always kind of been on teams that can excel in those circumstances. In situations where they are kind of expected to do well, they kind of stiffen up at the first sign of resistance to an extent. I think that it's not necessarily that Prey and Gorilla are the ones underperforming in these scenarios, though. So maybe in cases where the rest of the team is looking up to them as the leadership figures, maybe they're just not good at controlling the environment in some of those situations. So,
I mean, that's the most important part of being a leader in the team as well, right? So perhaps that is a thing to look at with the new players in this roster. That, like, some of them have existed in other teams. The Peanut may have been the best addition to the roster for having an extra bit of leadership there from other rosters. But I mean, ultimately, if they are the ones being looked up towards and they are the ones that need to be leaders, but they're not leaders by design, then it's a challenge that you could put towards this team on how they combat that. And I think they've already taken steps, so you might be aware of it.
Okay. So the team I actually want to talk about now, because first of all, fuck all Western fans. And secondly, it's also not going to be super long segment because no one watches LMS. What do you think about the Flash Wolves? Because obviously the bizarre part about the Flash Wolves is they actually, for me, perfectly embody that strange narrative that you get, which is that when someone isn't praised enough, people will start to notice, hey, actually these people tend to perform better than you'd expect. They're really underrated. But the problem always comes, and everyone knows what this is, the tipping point where when everyone keeps calling you underrated, you then almost inevitably become overrated in the context of that, because how could you be underrated if everyone fucking says that? And the problem is, obviously, every time Flash Wolves is a favourite, they massively underwhelm. And every time everyone goes, write them off, they're fucking shit, is when they always have a performance like we saw at times in this tournament. So who were the Flash Wolves who turned up this time, Kelsey? Because obviously there was one difference, which is they don't have Karsa anymore, who was kind of a defining player. You've muted yourself, by the way.
I think the surprising thing for me, because I was like looking over some of their games, was that Maple and Mugen just didn't seem to trust each other in the regular season of the LMS nearly as much, because it would be Maple would have consistent pressure and Mugen would still be afraid to get vision for him around river or something like this. But they looked really, really strong as a duo coming into the tournament. And also I think that SwordArt has always kind of been the guy who looks amazing on engaged supports, but really sucks in mage meta, and he comes out with like Soraka and shit like this and looks really strong. So I think that these are some of the significant differences that you can look to. I also think that, I mean, if you want to talk about someone who kind of defined the meta or had like an amazing impact on what kind of made the tournament, like Flash Wolves drafts for the most of the group stage were just really, really strong. Like they always had a really, really good idea of how we're going to set up to counter these champions, or like how we're going to play out these lanes. Like the last draft that they picked against Kingzone was just like pretty insane overall. They managed to get pressure in almost every lane on blue side. So yeah, I mean they had a lot of that kind of thing going for them. So I think that was very helpful. But then they get into the semifinal and a lot of that was gone. They seemed a bit out of sync in terms of they didn't even understand how they were winning, because Flash Wolves is a team that if they don't get vision on bot side, they just completely collapse across the map. So I think that they started over prioritizing their recon pick, like Rusty pointed to before with the RNG thing. So it was just weird to see them regress like that.
Yeah, I think that was coming into playoffs. Naturally, there's this feeling of needing to be comfortable on the stage, and they are still a fairly young team. There's experienced members there, but perhaps Karsa was the leader and SwordArt's now the one having to take the reins with Maple. Like who actually knows the inner workings of that organization? I think they started off super strong, right? Like you mentioned the draft. I think they just had a really good read on the patch, on the meta, and on the style of the tournament, and they're able to come in and smash everybody through that. and then, playing towards their bottom lane, who looked surprisingly outstanding, perhaps even surprising some of the other teams at the tournament. But as it progressed, they kind of stuck to the same style, or they tried to stick to the same style and just perfect it more than, adapting, innovating, and doing what these other teams at the event tend to do. And so they did start to flounder a little bit more and get exploited just a little bit more.
Okay. Do they, obviously, Kelsey, one of the reasons why it's hard to stick to many of the historical narratives on Flash Wolves is, like, over the years, they have basically changed so that there's only two constant players that are still there from the years ago that we first remember seeing them break on the scene. So how much actually do you think can go forwards in terms of Flash Wolves here?
I just give a ridiculous amount of credit to SwordArt because I feel like this guy is just... Obviously, Maple has always gotten a lot of praise. Karsa has always gotten a lot of praise, but I just feel like SwordArt is consistently one of the top supports in the world coming from a region like the LMS. And he always has something like... The team always does something smart, and it's usually focused around like operating through bot lane in some way, or freeing up the support to roam, or getting an early lane swap. Like their lane swaps were always incredibly smart when that was like early lane swaps were a thing and things like that. So I don't know if this is true or not, but I attribute a lot of stuff to just SwordArt and his read on stuff. So I don't know. Yeah.
Can also apparently just lane with anyone.
Yeah. There you go.
Playing with people who are perceived as bad AD carries on top of that as well. Somehow make them all look good.
That's just all LMS AD carries for the last 2 years or something. There was that one guy in AHQ, and then everyone tried to hype him after one split, and then he went to that Worlds, and they were like, "Shut the fuck up, mate." Anne, my boy Anne.
Pretty much.
Right. Okay. As I said, the Flash Wolves segment will be short and sweet. I have one other question, though, is how do you think that... Is there something different about how they approach best of ones? Because obviously best of ones is where they've gotten all these amazing upsets, including over Koreans, with some bizarre consistency. Is there something about how they approach best of ones, whether it is through the draft or how they play? Because, obviously this is like a classic example of what I always used to tell people, which is that, I'm not gonna go too ham on this, but there was that classic line that Jat said that just triggered me. He triggered me worse than TSM arriving and seeing a Cassio locked in top lane, because I'm still talking about it 4 years later. But when he said that epic line when TSM won the one game against Samsung White, where he said, if you can win one game, you can win something like you can win three, which is like, I believe I even made a whole video segment where I went into why that's just categorically wrong on all levels. But that is, something that naively fans might think. They might think, well, best of five is just 5 best of ones in a row. But as Flash Wolves are a great example, it's not really, is it? So what do you think they do differently in best of ones?
I think for best of ones, they usually have a very solid foundation for how to play the game in a solid draft, and they are able to actually kind of change small inner workings within that draft and complement their play style being aggressive. I think that for their jungler as well, he was very unlocked through Maple, which was a rarity to see. They had a mid-jungle strength where most of the other teams were focusing towards, jungle going to the bottom side of the map. They were able to play more consistently. They showed that they can change their top laner as well and hard carry and do all these different things, which is, one aspect of a 5-man composition changing in every game is still enough of a surprise to throw people off in a best of one. Whereas in a best of 5, you could maybe throw a ban at it in the next game, or it's not going to exist because you have a counter strategy. Picking red side, whatever it is. I think that's where they start to run short.
It's interesting because I think that Flash Wolves almost always have some thing that they haven't been pushed on before. It's usually the support pick or something of that nature, where if you ban the Alistar, then they fall apart. In this case, I think it was much more to do with they didn't really know how to react if they couldn't get pressure in bot lane. So I think because they just pivoted so much on getting that first turret, going to top side, getting that next turret, and then holding the map like that before you get to a point where you have to try to set up Baron and everything falls apart. because it's Flash Wolves and they still don't know how to play mid to late game. So I think that was a big problem for them when they're going into the semifinal and they're blind picking their support every game. So.
Oh, by the way, on the topic of their top laner, Hanabi, who obviously people will remember traditionally when Flash Wolves in the past, for example, had the Stake guy. He obviously was not a strong top laner. And then MMD was like okay, probably fairly shaky on the international stage. So obviously no one was expecting this guy to be like a carry top laner and produce some of the performances he did. What's funny is when I was looking up during the tournament on the Gamepedia for his page, it has a little detail in his biography that is fucking hilarious because it just says, prior to joining Flash Wolves, Hanabi was a Yasuo and Zed 2-trick. And obviously, when you see that, you go, it's a bit weird. And then you remember, wait a minute, you only joined in December 2017. So up to December 2017, this guy was playing only Yasuo and Zed top lane. Holy shit, this sounds like the most toxic top laner you could ever be locked in.
He was a mid laner.
Right, I see. Okay.
Yeah, he was a toxic Yasuo.
That's still pretty
Zed.
bad. Wait a minute, he was Zed in 2017.
Yeah, it's still bad, but yeah.
Wait, is he aware as he exists as a champion? What's going on? Holy shit. Tell you what, they must have an amazing coaching staff. Underrated coaching staff.
Their coach now is Axine. Rusty might remember him. I actually thought he came over in the original WE roster at the same time as Insec and Zero. And
super old Korean player, yeah. Who used to play one of the Najin teams or something.
And he's since floated around like coaching a bunch of various teams. He was on Masters 3 since when they had like their good split kind of, and they went up to third place or whatever. He's always sort of been on these like kind of underrated, overperforming teams. So I don't know, maybe he knows what he's doing, you know?
I have met some coaches that are obsessed with doing that as well. Like there are some people out there in the coaching world that cannot be on a good team. They have to be on a bad team and make it a good team. And it sounds like he's one of those people as well. Without fail, if the team succeeds, he's leaving next split, he's joining a 10th place team, and he's going to make it third instead.
Basically, we call that pulling a reverse Nico the Pico. Hold. Everyone hold. Hold. Right. No response. Good. Well done. Congrats. You passed the test on that one. So could have got you. But right. Okay. What about this then? So obviously, all opinions around Fnatic at this tournament were at the fever pitch of, I don't even know. It just went from one. Okay. We'll say on the positive side, a 13-year-old girl who's been noticed by her favourite boy band member. You know, there may be jubilation, unduly hysterical euphoria around any wins. On the downside, I don't know, a 13-year-old girl who saw someone on Twitter once say something bad about her favourite girl. As you can see, unfortunately, I have to say, congrats to European fans, because I actually realise now we've been unfair to NA fans. Not really, a lot of morons out there, but I think a lot of it got skewed by the fact we kept sending TSM to the international tournament. So obviously they're the worst of the NA fans. We all know that. So you weren't sending the best, we were sending the deplorables of NA. And the problem is, as a result, Fnatic's fans have skated by for too long. And at this tournament, bearing in mind Team Liquid went, like, come on, man. Team Liquid fans are like CLG fans at this point in time. They've been beaten down so much. They're just bloody grateful to have a chance to even go to a tournament. Like, they're not talking shit. Come on. I mean, the best they did was talk shit versus Fnatic. Like, they weren't trying to pretend like they do anything big. Fnatic fans at this tournament were unreal. It was actually like literally, when they got those couple of wins in the group stage, you'd have thought they were like 7-0 or something, the amount of shit talking about how Broxer was like, oh, he played like a man. Like, come on, man. Anyway, so let's get some reasonable opinions. Where was Fnatic at this tournament, Kelsey? Obviously started pretty poorly, got it together at some point. Did they ever actually kind of hit the top level of what someone might have hoped for from Fnatic?
So obviously there was a lot of excitement when they played that game against Kingzone. But I looked at that draft and I was like, this is the most Fnatic draft I've ever seen, by the way. Like, everyone is super comfortable. Everyone is super happy. Like, you've got the Tristana, you've got the Skarner, you've got Braum. And then it's I even think I think Caps, I think Corky, even though that might be a little bit weird, but that was like one of his most map related influential picks in the ULCS regular season. So I just see this as like, yeah, stars are not gonna go align like this throughout the rest of the group stage, and they didn't really. So I think that was kind of their peak at that point. Fnatic relied a lot on doing like level 1s and setting up for level 1s with like Braum Ezreal lanes or Braum lanes or things like this throughout the regular season in EULCS. And then some teams were scouting them obviously a little bit and avoiding these level 1s. And so when they didn't get their level 1s, they didn't have as convincing of a bottom lane start. And I think that they got kind of used to having the advantage in the level 1 and not necessarily having to draft strong lane setups. So they would just scale and team fight. And they kept trying to match teams with this when you have like better, pretty strong team fighting teams, pretty strong early game teams at this tournament. So that was an issue overall for me with Fnatic. So there you go.
I mean, I'll give them some credit. They did go 1-1 against most teams except for RNG right at the tournament. So you give them that in terms of results, but there were some things that just absolutely set me off watching it that I do not like. And there's a conversation on picking comfort champions that I think is always going to be in the forefront of my mind when you mention Fnatic at this tournament, because there's comfort that works for you, right? Like Ezreal for Uzi. I think that's a comfort pick for him because he's played it for years. He'll be good at it. And whereas Kaiser's a new champion, he had to learn. But really, Sivir, like this time, like the fourth time in a row.
Like the Sivir, honestly, every time they picked the Sivir, it was good. I had no issues with the Sivir pick. Like I thought it was good into the matchups that they picked it. I did not understand how everyone focused so hard on Rekkles' champion pool, but Hillsong is picking fucking Braum every game, and this guy goes unscathed the entire event. No one gives a shit that this guy can play basically 1 or 2 champions, and everyone is picking mages. Like, okay, everyone's picking mages into them, and people are like saying, but you're gonna lose bot lane because your support matchup is bad, so how dare you play a champion that scales Rekkles? You should be going in full force, trying to punch people in a losing support matchup, just straight up right there. Okay,
again, I will reiterate a point I've made on past videos. Love Kelsey's fake Redditor voice when she does that. It's outrageous.
I was about to say that.
It's hilarious. Yeah.
That was fantastic.
Even if you can't always follow the point, you're just in with it. You're like, yeah, I'm getting in the energy. Yes, I'm loving this. Yeah, I'll bring this character back more.
But they picked the Sivir into Jhin. I think at least, and they picked the Sivir also into Tristana, I think. I want to say Tristana.
Yeah.
But for me, this was like, this is fine. You can pick Sivir into those matchups. It's okay.
So I will say that I don't have an explicit problem with the Sivir as a pick. I think that if your support can only play 1 champion and everyone's playing ranged champions, then you shouldn't be picking a 3-item AD carry and trying to scale with it, even if the AD carry matchup seems fine. And a lot of the game states have been over before they got to the 3 items in the first place. I think that with like Caps was having the tournament of his career in terms of his own individual performances. I thought he was fantastic. But they are like still relying on Baron steals to get them to 3 items, to get them to the point where the Sivir will be insane and actually be super strong in team fights. And they got there sometimes. There were steals sometimes. But I think that like the bottom lane is a 2v2 draft. And I mentioned the Sivir. I do think it's because of the support champion pool. Mm-hmm. I just don't think it should have been Sivir at all.
I'm not sure how much the top lane pool had an effect on, because there were times when Bwipo seemed a bit pinched when like Ornn and GP or whatever were off the table. So I'm not sure like if it was just a perfect storm of situations where Bwipo wasn't necessarily super comfortable or super gelled with the team, so they had prepared like these setups the most. I know that they so for me this is like kind of, I'm not entirely sure where the disconnect was, but I will agree with you that there was like some stuff that just wasn't working out for them, and they eventually adapt. And it's not like Rekkles doesn't play Ezreal. He played Ezreal all games in the Fnatic semifinals. So
semis, yeah.
Should they have used Soaz more or used him entirely? Like, is that just a conversation people have because they lost now?
It's hard to say. I do think that Soaz brings a lot of, like, he's very good at absorbing pressure, and maybe that's why they chose to play like more like safe bot lanes and like pressure top lane setups, is just because Soaz is fine if you leave him alone. Maybe Bwipo is like less so. And I also think that Soaz kind of adds an element of, okay, he's roaming from top lane and at like good timing to give pressure to the mid aspect. Like his teleports are generally on point. And then Fnatic kind of fell apart a little bit more in the mid to late game, and I don't know how much that was to do with like the communication or whatever else. So more so than they had domestically, at least. Yeah.
What do you think, Rusty?
Yeah, I think they could have. I mean, I think they could have tried to play Soaz a little bit more if there was no legitimate injury concerns or need to rest him. And he played a game, right? So that clearly doesn't seem to be the case. I think whilst we spoke to, there's draft diversity that's always a possibility when changing top laners as well. And if there is a concern with Bwipo being challenged in champion pool, even if the champion pools are similar, like let's just say in game one, someone comes in and shits on you with Cho'Gath and then they swap to the other top laner. Do you ban the Cho'Gath, right? So things like that always persist through changing top laners. I think could have been explored from them for sure if that ever became an issue. And I think just having the intangible of an experienced and calm voice in the top lane may have helped and done wonders for them when the bottom lane's perhaps trying to scale and the teleports are needed.
The upside was that we did see a performance from Soaz here. No, I'm not talking about against EVOS. Obviously on Twitter, we got a classic Soaz emo tweet into deletion, into retraction of everything said in the tweet, and implication that you never were actually complaining about your team or the situation you're in, and you love all your teammates and no problem with Fnatic whatsoever. What I loved about that was, like, that was just so absolutely ridiculous. Like, what I love is he created the whole drama, perpetuated the drama, clearly implied it was to do with his team and how he didn't, like screwed him over, etc. Then, obviously, his retraction, which, let's face it, was obviously after someone came into a room and was like, you will be deleting that tweet and apologize. Something along those lines clearly happened. But what I love is, I just love it when people try to pretend like everyone misinterpreted them when everyone interpreted them entirely accurately. Because I'll give you a little teaser here, because a lot of you won't know this story, because the beloved League of Legends caster Gman, obviously, part of the reason he left League of Legends was he went to work for ESL. He wasn't going to do ELCS anymore. And for ESL, believe it or not, for a while, he was actually doing Counter-Strike. He was doing CSGO. And what happened was, in Counter-Strike, unlike the Riot world, where you're all just under Riot, we have a little bit more leeway, a little bit more wiggle room. And so, at the time especially, if you've kind of fucked with the other CSGO casters, I'm not going to say like we could end your career or anything. It wasn't that ridiculous. We wouldn't do that really. But we could definitely choose not to work with you or just, imply as much. And so there's a lot of politics is what I'm saying. And what happened was D-Man was sort of getting a little bit edged out because, he'd come on a little bit too strong with some of the CSGO casters and sort of hadn't really paid his dues and stuff. And so what happened was, when he realized that he wasn't going to get a lot of the gigs, even for ESL, that were like the top CSGO events, he did a stream in which, in the stream, he said something like, Semler, who was one of the top casters at the time, like, Semler's like, been pushing me out the scene. And then he said this mad thing where he went, insecure much, or some mad lie like that in the stream, right? And then this is what's hilarious. Obviously, all the Reddit posts were like, wow, D-Man's like blaming Semler and suggesting that he pushed him out the scene. And then D-Man himself saw the Reddit posts and was like, on Twitter, said something like, typical Reddit, just reading into everything. It's like, well, that's literally that's exactly what you said. Like, that's clearly what you implied. Like, you can't just have to be like, oh, bloody media lied about all the things I've said. Like, that is what you said. So I'm just glad Soaz has still got it in him. I'd be more sad if he was just totally indifferent, and he really had just... Like, that's actually the thing about Soaz. This is what's weird. NA fans, I'm going to make you realise why you should love Soaz as a player. First of all, he's a straight fire player, and his longevity is amazing. But beyond that, his longevity of his personality and his passion is actually amazing. Because here's the thing. You guys are thinking, what passion? Like, he's always complaining. He always has that dour fucking look on his face, even if he's actually like winning or whatever. He's always like self-deprecating humor where it's like he's just trash talking himself, right? Okay, it's not passion like extrovert, like he's like, oh, I love everyone, like, oh, I love the game. But like, think about it. If you've played for that many years, and this is a guy where I've referenced this on many shows, this guy told me in season 3 that he didn't actually like League of Legends, the game, anymore, and he just played because he could be a top pro. That was 5 years ago. The guy has played half a decade since then, still wants to play. And even better, remember, since he's French, you don't look for when he says like, oh, cool, this is amazing. No, you know a French person cares when they whine like a motherfucker, and he still does that like a champion. So all I'm saying is, Soaz still cares, the passion is still there. I love that. I love that shit. Whereas I don't like it when Team Liquid's like, we lost, haha, guess we just suck. It's like, come on, man. Could some of you at least, well, in that case, I guess bizarrely I've made Olleh the actual fucking hero of Team Liquid then. He actually just removed himself from the game. Speaking of which, we will move to that next, but I do have to address the obvious topic, which Kelsey sort of like skirted around. Okay, let's not criticize Rekkles' champion pool. Let's just criticize Rekkles, the LCS champion, playing in the pool of AD carries that were some of the best in the world. Kelsey, you're not gonna take the maddest contrarian heel turn and defend Rekkles' actual play in this tournament, are you?
And no, I don't think that he played exceptionally well overall. I think that some of his matchups, were super bad, and he should lose those lanes. And that's a fair point to make. Like he's not going to get insane amounts of CS up in losing matchups, but at the same time, he wasn't coming through with like the best team fight positioning or looking for the same opportunities that like people in EU LCS have come to expect when watching Rekkles in a team fight. So I don't think that this was a super good showing from him overall.
Because what depressed me, Rusty, is like, obviously, I wouldn't say I'm like a Rekkles hater, because hater's a bit extreme, you know. At best, I just talk shit on people. I guess that's sort of like hating, but the difference is I don't actually have real malice behind it, you know. And usually, if you notice, it's not like I pick people arbitrarily and hate them on their fucking haircut or something. It's usually that I don't like the style of play that they have. And so, actually, the sad thing is, over the last year and a half, I'd say roughly, Rekkles has actually been winning me over. Like, I've actually been looking and going, fuck, he's actually developed exactly the way I always hoped he would. Like, I don't know what reflection he's done to come to these conclusions, you know. In fact, everything he now says in interviews, obviously you can say a lot of PR answers, but it seems to fall in line with it. You know, he actually wants to be responsible, and he wants to be like the main reason the team wins or loses, and therefore takes the responsibility on his shoulders, which obviously would have been the opposite of what I criticised him for in the past. So this did feel fucking underwhelming to watch this tournament, because it felt like we had sort of reversion to some degree, you know. What did you think of Rekkles in this tournament?
Yeah, I think that if we do take the champions out of the equation, I think he psyched himself out a little bit earlier on into the tournament. You know, coming into that first day, the way that he played against Uzi, I think that goes without saying that he was too careful. He wasn't the regular Rekkles that you see in the EU LCS that tries to make some more aggressive decisions. And I actually think that towards the end of the tournament, of his run in the tournament, I should say, he was starting to warm up to the stage again. But by that time, he was picking himself into the scaling AD carries and the Civers and drafting for a bit later. So you never got to see at any point really in the tournament the dominant Rekkles of the ELCS. And I think that actually just cements the point that he is not as good as some of the other AD carries at that tournament. And that's just a fact that he'll have to improve on, because look at who he was staring down at the event, right?
Yes. And I mean, I know obviously people are going to say, but yeah, yes, look at the LCS. It's like, come on, mate, we're not giving anyone else a break for fucking rocking the regular season and doing nothing internationally. I can't just give this guy it just because he's got great looks. Actually, to be fair, his looks actually aren't that great nowadays. He's just all right. You know, I think people are overhyping that. If anything, that's why I do feel like this guy's been on testosterone or something. Can someone check what PEDs this guy's been on? He's just changed as a person. Kelsey, obviously the team itself had its flaws. Do they try to play around Rekkles too much?
I think that this one actually, they moved away from that. They were setting up to, and part of the reason why Braum was successful and like some of these other supports were successful for them is that they could get pressure from bot and move it to mid. which was very, very popular in the EU LCS, was to kind of use side lane pressure and then go through river and help mid lane and snowball mid lane like this. So I would say that this was much more of a diverse strategy. They had been trying out much more diverse stuff from that perspective. At the same time, I think that there were certain flaws in their overall play in terms of like setting up macro in the mid to late game, but they still relied a lot on just having like really strong AD and mid players when it came to team fights. Like for me, my EULCS MVP, which I didn't get my individual vote anymore, but my EULCS MVP would have been Caps and not Rekkles, just because I felt like that was much more the focal point of the team, and that was much more like kind of what was really stood out to me about the team in general this split.
Okay, so why was why was Caps such a standout at this tournament then? Because actually during the split, one of the more underwhelming things, I mean, it's about fucking time, was that in theory, like, mid laners weren't just popping off all the time, and it wasn't really like the best role necessarily to have in a team as it was in years gone by. So what was different in this tournament?
I think for Caps, the first thing you have to look at is that he was changing his play styles as required. You know, the Yasuo is obviously the first one that does come to mind. He brought it out early into the piece as well and looked dominant on the champion, which is a very hard thing to do and shows that he was practiced on it. But I think for me, watching Caps play, you could feel the confidence about him. You're picking the Yasuo, but also being confident to make the plays and do well on it is something that is very hard to maintain as a pro player, is asserting that confidence there, even in an international tournament. And then he would go to the Talia the next game. He would roam and he would help the rest of his map, the jungler, the bottom lane as required. I think that he was decent working with Broxah. His vision was also decent and when he was placing it. But overall, I just think that he was mechanically very strong. He was playing a bunch of different champions and styles, and he was really feeling it.
There were also times where I felt like Fnatic were maybe overly aware that they were winning only through Caps effectively, where they just kind of got to points where they were over-forcing around mid when they didn't have control on the rest of the map, and so like the rest of the enemy team would be dogpiling on him for overextending. So I think it was just, for me, the thing that stood out to me the most about Fnatic wasn't like Rekkles underperforming, it was just how kind of a mess they were in terms of like conveying what's happening on one side of the map and translating that into behavior that the players should have on the other side of the map. So
what did you think of Team Liquid?
I really don't know how I feel about Team Liquid. I think, watching that team play, I think they have the recipe to succeed in a lot of ways, especially coming into this tournament. Having Doublelift playing in the form that he actually had through the event, having a facilitative mid laner that can work around them as well. Same thing goes through the jungle role. Then having the capabilities for big plays top lane, great teleports as well, and the team fighting. Like, that should all be there for them. And I felt like coming into this tournament, they seemed smart when they were given time to set up, when they were given like a 5-minute buffer to, look for the objective, set up the vision for the objective, make the play for it. And then very rarely were they stopped in doing that, especially in an LCS. But in this tournament, I think it moved faster than they were prepared for, faster than they were able to really deal with. And I think they were caught off guard by that a little bit, especially at the start of the tournament.
I would say that North America at this point should be aware of what their problems are, and because it is literally a joke on Twitter. And the fact that it is literally a joke on Twitter and they still haven't acknowledged it, and they still think that all you can do is dogpile mid and 5v5, and they aren't acknowledging consistent errors in their macro play that are letting them down as a region. And then they go back to, but our server size is too small, is actually just a fucking joke. So there you go.
Okay, fair enough. I have to say though, Team Liquid themselves outdid anything I've ever seen from any other NA team in regards to that whole Olleh move where he was like, I'm removing myself from the lineup. Let's please put in a player who doesn't even play in LCS. There you go, mate. This will be better for all involved. Like, mate, if you tell me that better be written on a fucking napkin and you're on a motorbike driving halfway across the fucking desert and we're never going to see you again. Don't come back 2 days later and be like, I'm back to play again. Are you fucking kidding me? What is this? Like I'm not even joking. I don't know any world in which, like, I have serious trust issues with fucking Olleh now. I don't think that guy can ever win me back over again. Even if he does, even if we're married for 10 years and he seems like he's been loyal to me, he's fucking giving me date night every week, you know, knows all my favourite movies, bubble baths, everything, I'd still have it in the back of my mind, like, who are you? I don't even know who you are. Like, what the fuck was that? And this is also how you know it's an NA team, right? If that was like an EU team that did that, we'd still be seeing threads about it right now. Everyone like forgave him after a day or something. What the fuck even was that?
Defeatist. Right? I feel NA's just gone, well, we're up shit creek already. There's no real paddle,
It's
but
like,
we've got this sub that we've never played before.
Is
So
there any
give
way
it a
we
shot.
could become more of a meme?
I'm gonna.
Oh, something.
Yeah, it isn't so much that there was a huge gap between Team Liquid and other teams at this tournament, because obviously between Team Liquid and Fnatic there was a tiebreaker.
Yes.
Fnatic had a lot of weird issues as well.
And Team Liquid obviously beat RNG in a game.
Like, Team Liquid beat RNG, they beat Flash Wolves, so they beat EVOS in one game. But the thing is, for me, is this is just, their problems were predictable from watching their games domestically, in terms of, okay, we're giving up this wave here to group here, and people in NA actually praise this approach to the game, but I feel like this is the thing that consistently loses them internationally. Like, some of their macro setups consistently lose them internationally, but they aren't being addressed. People still say, like, it's better to play 5v5 comps, and that, like, playing these types of other setups are a waste of time. So I just, either because we're not good enough to execute them, or because that will never work in a more elaborate scenario. And it's just, eventually, as the tournament progressed, we see Impact playing more dedicated side laning champions. Like, Pobelter couldn't figure it out, but we see him doing that. And maybe, yeah, he's still giving up more waves to group way too often, but, like, you're seeing them be able to balance the map a little bit better over time. And it's like, okay, that is a positive thing that they can take away from this tournament. So there you go.
Also, I have to say, it's actually amazing how few victories internationally NA teams have over the top Korean teams. Like, at this point in time, they couldn't fucking trip over and get a win against some of these. Like, it's so rare it's ever happened. It's got to be the most one-sided of all the, like, domestic matchups I can even think of. Because obviously, even as we mentioned before, like, Flash Wolves themselves probably have, like, 3 times more wins than NA has against fucking Korea over the last half a decade. It's actually ridiculous. And I think that actually does. It's one of the most subtle ones, because obviously no one expects you to beat the Koreans. But every single different team I've seen play against the top Korean team, they look like mentally they're not even in it when they go even in the fucking server. Never mind the game stats. Like, they already do really believe they've lost. When other people say that and give it up to the Koreans, like, yeah, they're obviously the best, you know, we're going to try our best. Like, I actually think, like, some of the EU teams think they can get an upset. Obviously, we know the fucking teams from the, like, LMS have done it before. China's won an okay amount against them. Again, not tons, but it's actually amazing how few NAs won against them, though.
I really do think that half of the battle is mental when it comes to playing against the best teams, right? And this is something that I will say to anyone, even if I've just, like, coached them for the first time, is if you don't think that you can win, then you will never win. Like, you are what you want to become, right? And I really do think that at this point, NA fans at the very least wouldn't expect them to beat Korea. And the teams themselves should come in expecting to be able to at least have a shot. But even some of the players in this team, they've been there and they've done it before, and they've lost to Korea a million times over. And perhaps that is something that has trickled through the years of losing to Korea, that a team like Liquid may not even be able to contest it. And that does actually not just trickle through Liquid, but the entire NALCS.
And Tim Seven Houston, I always mispronounce his name, like the Oracle's Elixir guy, made a tweet that said, "Oh, everyone believes that their region is the second best, and the only team they're okay with losing to is Kingzone." It's like, well, why are they okay with losing to Kingzone? Like, why is that just an accepted reality going into every tournament? Is that we absolutely cannot, like, we just had a Worlds where 2 regions had 5-game series against SKT. Like, 2 separate teams from 2 separate regions just had 5-game series against SKT. Why do we auto forfeit mentally when we go into every fucking tournament against the LCK teams? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, especially because in this one, Kingzone lost twice in the first 5 games or something. So it's like, it should be open season at this point in time. When you see oh, wait a minute, don't some of these guys choke? Get these motherfuckers! That should be your dream to get the win that, I mean, admittedly, knowing how Twitter analysis works, everyone would, if you all beat Kingzone, just be like, it's all fucking Kingzone, Korea's still number 1, should have been SKT. Like, they still do that, obviously, but you get to beat them, so who cares? Okay, from this tournament, does this not just make you worry about Team Liquid if Team Liquid ends up being a Worlds representative?
I don't know if that makes me worry too much. I actually think that, Kelsey alluded towards it before. We saw some good things from them, like playing the Yasuo in the mid lane, trying to be able to pick a side lane pressuring champion. The Talia can exist as well. Trying to pick carries in top lane. I think that these active attempts, and I will always say, losing at international is something that NA needs to do a million times over to learn how the better teams and regions are doing it. They could take that home.
They disagree with you there, Rusty, yeah, because they've lost more than anyone, mate. So.
But even if they don't improve from it, they can take that information, that knowledge back, and they can use that. And the teams that lost to Liquid will be watching this backstage being like, man, we really suck if Liquid beat us and they're now 0-4 in the first week, and they try and fix that themselves. So I think, I wouldn't count Liquid out coming into Worlds immediately, but it's hard not to just start to count NA out a little bit early already because it's NA at this stage.
And Liquid, especially the Olleh thing, it's like the justification is that he's nervous or down on himself, but it's like if you literally after one game have to remove yourself from the tournament, then yeah, that's a bad sign in general. So yeah, I am worried basically on that one fact alone for Team Liquid at World if they go to Worlds.
It was, by the way, it was just he felt bad, right? It wasn't anything serious, some serious illness, right?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
It's been nerves or to reset mentally or something like this.
Because now I know it's not anything serious, I can make a joke. So my joke would be that he's obviously the anti-PawN, because what he would do is, when it got to game 5 of the final, he'd be like, I need to rush off to hospital now and be replaced by the substitutes. Whatever. Had to be done. Nice reference as well, classic reference back to the LPL there. Brought it all full circle again. The other thing as well is, I've actually thrown myself off there. Where were we going with this? Let's think. Oh, I tell you, the one thing that I did appreciate about Team Liquid's performance at this tournament, though, Kelsey, because obviously, it was touch and go. They could have made the playoffs. If they'd have made the playoffs, I wouldn't have been able to do this. But because they didn't make the playoffs, but Flash Wolves did again, I obviously got to do one of my classic Twitter triggerings, where my favourite type of Twitter triggering, because here's the thing, you'd think, right, with my personality, the best way to trigger people would be a classic, Thorin hyperbole, this team's total shit. But actually, the best way to trigger people, I've learned, is to put no editorial spin, no opinion, and just give facts that people cannot handle, that are the pills they refuse to swallow. So all I did was just point out that, for example, LMS regions made loads more top 4s at MSIs than NA has. And what's good is, they don't even, because it's not an opinion, they don't respond in the same way that they would if you were dissing them. They can't just play it off I was just joking. What they do is they go straight into the most pure form of cognitive dissonance. All the responses are stuff like, why are you saying this? What has that got to do with anything? It's they just go straight to you can almost hear the fucking smoke coming out the side of their head, all the circuits are just crackling and popping off. Like, it was fucking beautiful. I was almost up there with when TSM get eliminated every year from Worlds, which, as I've described, is like my second birthday. But sadly, that might not even happen this Worlds.
I think LMS have been 3rd, 4th in every MSI since its existence as well. So they've actually done very well in that particular tournament.
Not bad, eh? Not bad, not fucking bad. Yeah.
I mean, it's just amusing to me that they introduced Vietnam as its own region, and then NA has to play. NA doesn't have to play the play-in stage anymore, but the LMS does. So,
well, and
it's a fun time.
Obviously, we won't put a lot of information into this, but that also is actually from the other end of the equation why it's so underwhelming when the NA teams do badly. Because it's one thing if like GAM was just the one like fucking Gambit / Moscow 5 of the Vietnam region. Apparently all these teams in Vietnam can actually play the game and give some upset potential. The EVOS team wasn't a joke. What would you say about them?
I would say that their identity was drastically different from the Gigabyte Marines as well. So they were an interesting team to watch for sure. They weren't necessarily like packing as much of a punch, but I feel like the thing about EVOS is they ended the tournament stronger, whereas Gigabyte Marines came in the tournament like full swinging and trickled out. EVOS actually, I feel like, ramped up and got a lot from it, and just like came out a better team and was harder to deal with as the group stage ended. So
yeah. I mean, I actually really enjoyed watching them play for that alone. You were seeing the growth, and there was always that lingering feeling, no matter who they played against, of who would they beat, and not in the same way that you would say that for the Gigabyte Marines. It's what kind of strategy will they use that no one knows what to deal with when you watch the Marines play. And when the Nocturne comes out, you just lose your mind. This was more conventional, just good League of Legends that they were trying to play and they were trying to beat their opponents with. And it was aggressive for sure. It was bloodthirsty, definitely. But it was just solid League of Legends. And that is something that may be a lingering concern for the other regions moving forwards. Like, the VCS is brand new, its first split. What if they continue to improve along this track?
And obviously they do have a couple of players who were Gigabyte Marines players last year, like at the last MSI. Who do you think were the best players on the EVOS team?
Stark has always been the star of the team, but Yijin was someone that came in and surprised massively. I'm not going to say that Yijin was this incredible show up. Like, he did the most amazing things you've ever seen. I think that the team knew how to support him very well and allow him to make the aggressive plays that he does. And sometimes, the team wasn't going to support him. It'd still make the aggressive play and then he would die from it. So I actually think that, top and mid lane being able to help him a lot more, collapse with him a lot more were the places that I would be looking. And Stark is a player that should always be looked at because he retires every split. I guarantee he retires at the end of this tournament and then comes back again for summer. But he always seems to, improve and show up very well when he does exist.
Okay. If you're going to have a jungler like Yijin, you can't really have a mid laner like Warzone. Warzone, they were really heavily prioritizing Cassiopeia, and this is a bit of a warning sign, but Warzone over time was just like losing pressure in matchups that he should win, and then Yijin would try to invade, and then it was over. So Yijin didn't necessarily pay attention to whether his lanes were pushing, and I wouldn't say that the lanes weren't supporting him in those scenarios. I would just say that was like poor understanding of when he could make those plays, and he was maybe trying to go for too much of the shock factor after people had already seen him play enough, So.
I think it was 2016 IWCQ when we first saw Warzone play, and he just fed his ass off. I'd never seen someone just lose that hard and look so bad, and then he was gone. They played their other mid laner for most of the tournament, so I was very surprised to see him here at all, very surprised to see that he won the tournament, and pleasantly surprised to see how well he had managed to do. But I don't think that his style necessarily worked for the team all that well, considering though he improved monumental amounts.
This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset, And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.